Hello, welcome to the Marriage Underdogs Radio Show. I'm your host, Chris and Matthews. And yes, you guessed right. Once again, I have another phenomenal guest. And yes, they are a licensed marriage and family therapist. I have with us Matt Genius. Yes,
Matt
genius.
Jeanius, that's right.
How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks for having me.
Man, I'm glad that you took time out of your busy schedule to be here. Those that have heard the show before, you guys know I always start with asking our guest, what got you into this amazing field of marriage and family therapy?
Man, beautiful question. And I love a lot of the answers, telling their stories of how they became intertwined with such an amazing field, right? For me, it started in high school, my junior year, when I was in a class called Law Studies. This is a class that offers the opportunity to do mock trials. And so in the mock trial, I had to select a character out of a hat at random. And so I selected a psychiatrist, a psychiatrist who's defending a woman who was one of the expert witness on the stand to defend a woman who murdered her husband. I'm like, sign me up. I'm interested. let's go, right? Let's learn. And so, of course, you have to do research for the character, and they give you all of the statements and so forth. So, in my research, I came across a terminology that drew me in, and I was caught. And the terminology was learned helplessness. Right?
Oh, say
I
that
heard
again?
learned helplessness.
Learned helplessness.
Learned helplessness, man, and it's a psychological term that talks about the helpless state of a person's mental, emotional, physical being after they've accepted a reality that's unhealthy for them, right? And so after we've accepted a broken, a hopeless, a stained reality, we come to a space of learned helplessness. We've learned how to accept that reality as our truth. And so in this scenario, this woman who murdered her husband, she was dealing with learned helplessness. And what was fascinating about the case was when the cops came to the house to to do their investigation, she called the cops. And this is a true story. Information just were redacted, names changed. She called the cops. When the cops got there, husband's body was on the bed, fully clothed, fully dressed. All his wounds were, patched up, no blood, murder weapon, which was a knife, was on the bed, laying next to him clean. The house was immaculate. So the cops were like, "Yo, what was this? What is this about?" So they asked us, like, "We don't understand. There's a murder, but there's no real evidence." And she was like, "Well, I had to make sure the house was clean before guests came, because if you guys came and it was messy, he would be upset with me. You know, he's already dead, and she's still thinking about the repercussions of his emotions based on having guests at the house, and the house is a mess." And so that term changed the way I view problems. I saw people, because I saw learned helplessness all around us. I saw it in our community. I saw it in our relationships. I saw it in work dissatisfaction. I saw it in a lot of different areas. And from that point, I was like, man, I got to study psychology. I want to learn more about the human brain and why we do what we do. And of course, after graduating or getting close to graduation, I wanted to figure out what field I was going to go in. The field for counseling are vast. There's clinical social work, mental health counseling, professional counseling, and by that time in my undergrad career, I had already gone to FAMU on a music scholarship, lost my scholarship because I was dealing with my own mental health issues as a Black man. And so when I got back in school to the point of graduating, I already had a lot of life experience, volunteering, working at schools, community centers, juvenile centers. And I wanted to see where I could make the most impact based on my own story of how I was raised and my parents and their background, and working, being and having experience in all those different areas. I want to see where can I make the biggest impact for the young Black men. And I'm like, man, I could be a clinical psychologist, I could be a child psychologist, I could be developmental, all these things about the growth and development of the child was where I was interested in. And then I came across family therapy by accident. I was doing some research on graduate programs for, counseling, and I came across family therapy. And whose research I found first? Murray Bowen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Murray Bowen. And when I was reading
Telegram.
when I was reading Bowen's work, it spoke to me so vividly. And I'm like, this is where I have to be. Because it made sense for my life, the transgenerational issues of seeing problems from the past and then seeing how they show up from your dad, from his dad, from, you know, and then how it shows up in your life. I
Breaking
was
the
like, yeah,
cycles.
yeah. I was like, man, this makes sense. This helps me understand myself in a different way. And I'm sure in the way it makes sense, I could help a lot of people. And so I found a program back in South Florida where my family were and made a couple phone calls, did an interview, got a couple, you know, of appointments where I can come on campus and meet the staff, meet the faculty. I did that and I fell in love. Family therapy was it for me because it just made sense to see things in the context of the system, of their origin, of their home, of their culture, and so forth. And so family therapy was it for me.
Man, that's a beautiful story. And I always find it fascinating to hear the stories, especially of Black men, because it's not a lot of us in this field, in the field of counseling in general, but especially
Right,
marriage and family therapy. The stories are always parallel when it comes to once we find that this work exists, because so
right,
many people don't even know licensed marriage and family therapists or MFTs are distinctively different than other professionals in the
right,
psychological realm.
right,
You mentioned in your story, psychiatrists who predominantly prescribe medication,
right,
psychologists who really specialize in the evaluation and
right,
diagnosis. Then you have your licensed clinical mental health counselor who's really doing one-on-one person centered. Then
right.
you have your social worker who I like to refer as the Marines. They do a little bit of everything. And
Wraparounds,
then,
yeah,
yeah, they do
yeah,
everything. Case
yeah,
management. And don't get me wrong, all these professionals are needed.
right.
But once you get to the licensed marriage and family therapist, you now have a professional who, and we were speaking about this prior to the show starting,
Right,
who's not only trained through a systemic lens, but we're required to obtain relational hours under supervision.
right.
And my pastor, he always says it's not what you expect someone to do, it's what you can inspect what they have done.
Wow.
So the inspection comes
Yeah.
through our requirements to obtain hours working with couples under supervision. So what is that for those that are listening? We have to work with couples with the oversight of a seasoned trained clinician that's also an LMFT
Right.
supervisor that
Yeah.
signs off on our hours.
And I love it because for me, it started my second semester in the program. So
Hmm.
by the time I got to just the second semester, I started seeing clients.
Wow,
And
that's special.
yeah, it was a great program at Nova Southeastern University. Shout out to Nova.
Yeah, they got
But
one of the top ones in the country.
yeah, so by my second semester, I was already sitting in front of clients using what we learned in class in real time. And so that jumped the learning curve even further for me and the, in the field of family therapy. And then my internship was a little different because my internship was a hybrid that allowed me to go off campus at an external site, which
Mm.
meant I didn't have to see clients in the context of a campus setting with the dual mirror, the two-way mirror
You
and
you
the
had the community insight. Now, I, I,
listen.
want to digress real quick because you
Sure.
mentioned that Black men
Right.
are a population in which you specialize in. Talk to us about what you find the issues in correlation to relationships. So that
Yeah.
could be relationships with parents, relationships with intimate partners, even
Yeah.
relationships with children or relationships with their fellow peers.
Right.
What common themes do you see in Black men who come to you and they're saying, Matt, I need help with my relationships?
Yeah. Yeah. It's usually the top are like vulnerability, being able to be
Mm.
emotional and connect, communication, of course, being misunderstood or not being able to avail themselves and listen in an appropriate way. Trust, of course, the trust issues date back to, childhood and safety. There's a lot of safety concerns when it comes to the male ego and emotion in these equations, when it comes to all of their relationships. And what I've learned is that there is a huge lack of understanding of intimacy, and so from a Black male to another Black male, what I really try to teach them is how to be intimate. And it starts with their relationship with themselves, of understanding what intimacy is for them, what it feels like, what it looks like, what it sounds like, and then creating it for the opportunity of then relating to someone
And,
else.
and what's a reframe on intimacy? And I ask that question because a lot of times when people hear intimacy, they automatically think of sex or
Yeah.
physical connection. But I hear you speaking of intimacy just by way of the generalization of connection. So if you were
Yes,
to reframe
yes.
intimacy, what would be another word or phrase we could use?
I would like to say that intimacy, when you look at it, it's any reason, any opportunity for connection, right? And
Hmm.
so there are plenty of opportunities out there, but I think the low-hanging fruit is the physical intimacy. It's easy because that's the one we are more commonly associated with romantic relationships. And so when people hear intimacy, they think, oh, let's get close and physical, right?
Right.
Which is good. But I think what I've learned is that when we primarily focus on physical intimacy, we leave a lot of great connection points on the table.
We
I like to
actually,
say,
you're right.
yeah, I like to say we leave a lot of currency on the table because
Yeah, it is. It is the currency because when I think about intimacy, the four major types, obviously physical is one that most people think of, but you have emotional intimacy, you have recreational intimacy, and then you have intellectual intimacy. And then to throw a bonus in there, you have financial intimacy, you have spiritual intimacy. So when you look at the 8 dimensions of health and wellness, each one of those can be a subset of intimacy.
Right,
Talk
right.
about where you find Black men in particular, the reasons why you feel like physical intimacy is one that is so rooted into the identity of a man. And you think about two men, especially in hip hop culture, music, it always aligns with the the conquering of another person,
Right, right,
right? And I
right.
say person
Yeah,
meaning
yeah,
it doesn't have to be just a sexual partner. It could even
yeah.
be, an op when you think about the opposition,
Yeah, yeah,
conquering of someone else,
yeah.
or all of the different, gang culture, all this toughness.
Right, right. But
You're
that exterior, I think, has been socialized in us for a very long time. And we have not had a chance to parse that reality as far as if is it our identity or is it us imitating life, right? And so we've adopted this to where we believe this is who we are. I hear a lot of the adolescents and young adults that I've worked with, Black men, say this phrase all the time. And I'm sure you've heard this before. Man, this is all I know. This
yeah.
is all I know. This is all I know, right?
Hmm.
And what is that? That's to say that they have come to the point of realization that this is all they know and all they will know. This is how things will be. They become fixed in their understanding of that's how I saw other relationships. That's how people related to me. And so the context of being intimate was never something that was seen, that was created to be valuable, that was created to be a part of their reality. And so we've lost the sense of what intimacy is based on the socialization of Black men in a culture that's actually foreign to them.
And it goes back to your original reason of why you got into counseling based on that story you shared. And what was the term earlier you mentioned?
Learned helplessness, learned
Learned
helplessness.
helplessness. It
Yeah,
all goes back to your core reason of what
yeah,
pulled you into the field. And something else you said I want to highlight. You mentioned, and this may have been in our pre-session before the
sure.
show, you
Yeah,
talked about the need for psychoeducation, the need for introducing new information. Expound on that a little bit more.
of course. When you think about how we are educated, and Black men and women are some of the most educated people in the country. Follow the stats. Black men and women, we're doing our thing when it comes to education, but what are we learning in these educational facilities? Where are we learning how to connect in a way that allows us to feel safe, feels us to trust, feels us to feel open and vulnerable, allows us to connect in a way that is meaningful for us and also brings value to the people we're connecting with. There aren't
It's not happening. It's not happening in corporate America. We know
That's
that.
what I'm saying. So it's not happening in elementary school. It's not happening in middle school, high school, colleges, university. I could even go further to say that a lot of these trainings aren't happening in our religious institution as well, because I actually studied theology.
For
I
sure.
was, yeah, so there's a lot of information that we adopt based on it just being transgenerational again, being passed down from one generation. That's how my mom did it. That's how my dad did it. So that's how I'm going to do it too. These things become a rite of passage. But the entire time, we still have a lack of understanding, and understanding comes from information that you gather based on interacting with the world. And so a lot of men show up with a lack of understanding. Psychoeducational brings that information in front of them in a way that is culturally appropriate, in a way that they can start to implement into their lives immediately, in a way that allows them to feel empowered because they know something different. You give your brain an option. You're like, man, I was only doing it this way. What you're trying to tell me, there are other options of emotions. There are other pathways of thinking. There are other ways to resolve conflict. There's another way to look at myself in this equation. I don't have. And so I open up with psychoeducation because counseling, of course, is a fine art that we've learned how to craft. In the counseling, I know my people needs education, so I implement psychoeducational as a part of my counseling, where I open up my, I do most of my sessions on Zoom now, but when I was in my office, I had a blackboard, and half of our session would be in the back on that blackboard, making sure these concepts are seen and in a visual way that they can start seeing, like, man, I did not understand that at all. I didn't have a clue about how these two are correlated and how communication is related to safety, and safety is related to trust, and trust is related to intimacy, and how all these things kind of build on each other. And so education has to be a part of how I address these problems. Yeah.
And I'm gonna share this too, and I'm not staying from a position of absolute, but this is an observation I've noticed.
Sure.
When working with Caucasian clients, white clients, they seek to want more knowledge on the why. Why do I feel this way? It's more introspective, like why. We go deep into all these whys.
Right.
When I work with African American clients, they want to know why too, but we get to why after we talk about how.
Right.
So when I hear you mention psychoeducation,
Right.
the how is important, and then we segue into the why.
Yeah.
But
Well, I do make space, of course, for them to process, and to create solutions before the education really can sink in. You don't want a person to come in and they're at a crisis, and you're trying to educate them. So
absolutely, you
of
give them the
course,
space to get the
right.
crisis.
Yes.
But I noticed that it had me think, because in session, there and every client's different, so none of these are absolutes. But in session, I've noticed that when I provide the psychoeducation with certain clients, they will be more trusting to be vulnerable.
Right.
It's almost like, okay, you're giving me permission
Mm-hmm.
to be vulnerable, because from the psychoeducation, I'm acknowledging that vulnerability isn't abnormal. Like,
Right.
nothing's wrong with me to express myself.
Right.
But there
It's a
has to
lot
be
of
a level of education to get to that point.
that's what it is. A lot of the education kind of rewires their thinking to
Right.
normalize a lot of what they've been experiencing, and then give names to it. Sometimes we know what we're experiencing, we just don't know how to address it, or what to call it, or how to then approach it. And so a lot of the times they're like, that's exactly what it is, man. I've been dealing with this the whole time. I just didn't understand how to.
What to
An
name it.
example, yeah, what to name it. An example is when I was an undergrad, I had severe anxiety and depression. I didn't know that's what I was dealing with. It showed up as anger. I was very distant, in school. I didn't show up to classes, but what I was dealing with underlining was anxiety and depression. My junior year in high school, I got robbed. My senior year in high school, 2 weeks before graduation, I got jumped. I carried a lot of that with me to college. And so when I showed up to college, I showed up as a person who wasn't interested in getting close, who could not trust, who didn't care about relationships as far as intimacy, because I was just looking out for what made me feel okay. So to double back on the question you asked earlier about the physical intimacy, why Black men, tend to be drawn towards that, that's a level of comfort, of coping that we've adopted from our young age, to where sex became a type of medicine for a lot of us. And so it's something that we can reach to ail our anger, sadness, coping, whatever. So instead of thinking it as an intimate opportunity for connection, we see it as a tool to mitigate our mental, emotional, physical, and other states like that. So,
Man, this is a masterclass in itself, because something that you said earlier, which helps connect all this, when you look at all of the different dimensions, you think of social economic status, having
right,
the opportunity to provide economically, and then you look at the providing of time, being present. If you have a parent with two or three jobs, because they need two or three income sources, then they may not have as much time with the child. So
right,
they're not present to deliver the education. Whereas you may have another family with the economics that are the economical advantage to be present. So they're gaining psychoeducation, using that word,
right,
throughout the lifespan.
right,
By the time they get into counseling as an adult,
right,
they've already been taught on emotional regulation. They've been taught on what vulnerability looks like. They've
right,
been taught that it's safe to express themselves.
right,
So we have to look at this process of counseling and helping people become their best selves
right,
systemically. It's not one piece.
right,
It all comes together.
right.
And I believe that's what makes LMFTs very unique.
Yeah.
I know we have a little bit more time left. And in this last question, I want you to expound more on your specific approaches. I know you're trained in a lot of different modalities, but for those that are listening and they're like, man, I want to contact Matt. I think he would be a good fit for me as a clinician. Or if there's an event coordinator listening and they would say, I'd love to have this brother come on stage, share what the client or the event coordinator could expect by having you come in their space. Let's start with the client and then transition into event coordinator
Yes, yes.
organization.
Got you, man. So what you could definitely expect is a curated environment where conversations can be had towards the healing, towards the healing that we're interested in, whether it's a small group, whether it's individual. My primary, one of my primary role is to make sure safety is being had. And that starts with just how they see me, how I show up into the space. And so for a lot of my sessions, I show up as is. I show up very casual. My practice is called Beachstone Counseling. So when I had my office in South Florida, it was near the beach. And so I dressed very casual. Sometimes I had sandal days. And what that did was it disarmed a lot of my clients when they came in to see someone so casual. So it's not a rigid space. And so I want to pride myself in the space I create for safety and having conversations individually and as a group or community, right? The other part of it is I love to focus on intimacy. This is where I'm really doing a lot of great work. I have a presentation that I've started, almost completed it, and I've kind of shopped it around. It's called The Intimacy of Thriving. And what that is it shows you how to create an environment based on intimacy, starting with yourself, and then how to then adopt that environment everywhere you go, so that if the environment is conducive, then you will always have intimacy, which will allow you to always thrive. But that environment is an intentional environment that we have to learn how to create internally first. And so if we can successfully do that, then it'll be easy. And so, of course, I use real life case studies. I use my own life example of during the pandemic, how all of our families were turned upside down. By the way, I didn't even have a chance to mention I have a big family. My wife and I have 6 kids. We had,
Wow, man.
yeah, we had our first daughter, then we had triplets, and then 10 years later we had a baby boy, and then just last year we had a baby girl, so he can have some company, right? So
Congratulations.
thank you. During the pandemic, what I realized with my older kids, the other kids weren't here yet, was that they were stressed. They were stressed a lot based on what we were dealing with as adults. And so I was thinking, how can I use our closeness to be a remedy? And our closeness was definitely the remedy. The intimacy we created was different from what the world was experiencing. So while the world was in chaos, inside the Genius household was intimate. And so we were thriving during the pandemic. And we did that with the intentional work of how I understand relationships should be, making my kids feel safe, making my wife feel safe, making sure their needs, their wants, their desires were met, making sure we can speak about our fears, making sure their emotions aren't devalued or stigmatized, making sure all the context of what makes them feel safe, trusted, vulnerable, and can communicate. We created that environment and we thrive. And so my goal is to help Black men, Black households understand, and organizations, because I do business consulting as well. And so when it comes to the organization, you have to understand that we do our best work when we feel the safest, when we feel, valued, when we feel trusted, when we feel that this is a space that'll, it's a conducive space. And so vulnerability and intimacy is something that we need to have in all our relationships, and the work relationship is no different. And so getting me to speak, you're going to get an intimate, good time learning, sharing, and growing, and then leaving there, being able to create a rich environment where we each can thrive in.
Man, wow. I'm speechless. This is phenomenal, man. I definitely got to have you come back on to go deeper in how intimacy is a remedy. It was a remedy
Yeah.
in your household, and it can be a
Yes, it
remedy, I
was.
believe, in the workforce. And just in general, we look at the current political cycle. We'll be voting on another president, and despite
Right,
what side or viewpoint you
right,
have,
right.
I believe we all can agree that intimacy, connection is something
Yeah,
that
yeah,
everybody yearns
yeah,
and needs, despite who you are. And I love how
yeah.
what you represent, Matt, cuts through every line. It
Right,
doesn't matter who you are or where you come from.
right,
Everybody can relate to the need to connect with another person.
right. Yeah, that's some of our basic needs: love, affection, and acceptance. And when you
Yes.
kind of look at what setting love, affection, and acceptance really thrive in, it's an intimate setting. Like
Mhm.
when you're dealing with a lot of the issues like, mistrust, then it doesn't allow you to feel like you can get close to a person, and then if you're dealing with your own trauma internally, then it doesn't allow you to feel like you can get close and trust. And so we have to make sure that we're processing and letting go of a lot of those things that's holding us back from what we naturally desire. I love to watch sports fans. I don't watch sports anymore. I watch sports fans, right? So, I love to just learn from people.
Not only fans, right? Sports.
Not sports fans, right? So when you watch sports fans and they're celebrating, they share a lot of intimacy. They don't know each other. They're strangers when they're at the games or even at the bar. One of their team scores, and everybody's hugging, they're high-fiving, they're celebrating. That's intimate, right? That's unintentional intimacy that we thrive on. We look forward to those instances. But what happens when we become intentional in creating those moments daily? Then we can collect more intimacy, which allows us to feel whole and then allow us to show up into this world a healthier person, a person that's thriving, because we know where the intimacy is and we know how to cultivate it on a day-to-day basis.
Man, that's special, Matt. Um, before we go, just give the listeners your contact information. It'll also be in the show notes in your bio. But just
Yeah.
those that are listening, they want to get contact with you.
Please, you can reach out to me in all things. Matt Jeanius, MatheJeanius. You can reach out to me in all things. I have books. I'm a children's author. I have 4 books that are out on Amazon. I have a business consulting agency with my wife called Genius Consulting. She's a 13-year educational veteran. And so we do a lot of training and consulting for businesses as well. You can find us at geniusconsulting.com, LLC.com, geniusconsulting, spelled the same way my last name is spelled. You can also find me on Apple Music, or on Spotify. I'm also an artist as well. I have music, and all of them are sensitive to what I want to accomplish, which is inviting the Black male in closer to create intimate understandings. And so all things Matt Jeanius. Beachstone Counseling is another way you can find me, beachstonecounseling.com or on IG. And that's it.
Hey, brother, it's been a pleasure. Once again, another masterclass. Thank you for coming on.
Of
And
course.
I don't mean that as an empty gesture. We definitely want to have you back.
Yeah, I'd love to come back, man. I know there's so much more we can dive
Yeah, we
into.
can unpack a lot more.
You mentioned that music, man. Music is like, I have a page called Hip Hop and Therapy, where I actually intersect the two together to have conversations about, what are we hearing and how are they meaningful to our mental and emotional state. So
Nice. Well, brother, I'm go ahead and let our listeners go. Uh, Stay on real quick after we get off. But for those that have tuned in, This is Marriage Underdogs Radio Show. I'm your host, Chris and Matthews. Episodes drop every Tuesday on Spotify and Apple podcasts as well. I thank you guys for tuning in, and we look forward to bringing you another episode next Tuesday.